Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today and bienvenue. My name is Kyla Sweet, the Education and Curriculum Specialist for Study Canada K-12. And on behalf of the Center for Canadian American Studies and the Western Washington University Alumni Association, welcome to the third of our 4 webinars that will help you add more global and diverse perspectives to your French classroom. And just a note that you may have seen in the chat, today's format's a little different to our previous webinars we've had. This is a meeting format, so one you might be more familiar with, where you can jump in and ask questions at the request of our presenter today, who I will introduce shortly. So that may mean you would want to, until you have a question or something along the way, definitely would like to mute you at this point and potentially have your camera off. But our presenter today has said as we go along, you can ask questions by using the raise hand icon, and we'll try to answer them as they come up. So yes, it'll be an interactive and slightly more informal in that way today. Looking forward to it. And the funding for this series is provided in part by a U.S. Department of Education Title VI grant, which supports the Pacific Northwest National Resource Center on Canada, a consortium of the University of Washington and Western Washington University. And a special welcome today, as always, to our cohort of French teachers who are attending all 4 sessions and reflecting on them with us. So welcome to you. I would also like to begin today by acknowledging that we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared land and waterways. So today I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Christina Keppie and her session, Acadia Strong. As I said, you may have noticed this is a meeting and not a webinar at her request in order to have a more interactive experience. So Dr. Keppie is a professor of French and director of the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University. And Professor Keppie hails from Fredericton, New Brunswick, and holds a PhD in French linguistic anthropology from the University of Alberta. She's taught broadly across the French undergraduate curriculum at Western Washington University since 2008, specializing in topics relating to Franco-Canadian and Acadian language, sociolinguistics, culture, and language ideology. And she currently directs the Center for Canadian American Studies at WWU, a National Resource Center for the Study of Canada in consortium with UW, and is the president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the United States. Top of all that, she is my boss and my director, and I'm very glad to welcome her today. Thank you, Christina.
Merci beaucoup, Kyla. Merci beaucoup. Et bienvenue tout le monde. I appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. Ça me fait grand plaisir de vous accueillir. As Kyla mentioned, this is a more informal meeting. It's the way I prefer it. I like to go with the flow. Je vais parler aussi en français canadien, ok? Donc, je vais dire des choses comme, je vais switcher entre le français et l'anglais parce que ça, c'est ma réalité. It's the way that I grew up. It's a little bit of the culture that'll kind of come into a discussion here today. So I'm also counting on those behind the scenes here today, our friends at the Alumni Association, to help me advance the slides. And so if I sort of forget to say anything to advance to the next slide, it's because I've had a little bit of a technological disaster here. Je suis présentement à Ottawa, chez mon frère. Et donc, on a eu tout un désastre de technologie pendant les dernières 45 minutes. Et donc, je suis ici avec vous aujourd'hui sur mon portable. Mais on est ici, je suis vraiment, vraiment contente. So I'm really, really touched to be asked to join and be part of this series today. And my topic is, as you can see from this first slide here, Acadia Strong. There may be a dog coming through here as well. Acadia strong. It is what I believe Acadia to be. It's what I believe the Acadians to be. And vous voyez, il y a le drapeau acadien avec, c'est comme le drapeau français avec l'étoile. And I'm going to treat this almost like one of my classes. And so I hope that the people, the Alumni Association can help me out with this. I'm going to start even asking questions. If you could put your hand up if you have an answer. Levez la main, s'il vous plaît. Do you know what that yellow star represents? Anybody? If you have your hand up, can someone answer, perhaps? Ah. Oui. Ça, c'est le drapeau, c'est le drapeau acadien, mais l'étoile, what that star actually means, there's a few stories behind it. But one that I really like to tell is that it represents the light from c'est quoi un phare en anglais? A lighthouse. Because many of the Acadians have a very strong attachment socioeconomically to the sea and aquaculture. And so one of the stories is that the light from a lighthouse would bring in the fishermen and bring them home safely. And so that is seen as a bit of a symbol. The lighthouse is a bit of a symbol for certain parts of Acadia. Acadia is very diverse, just like la Francophonie, which is why we're here today. And so that is one of the stories, or one of the reasons why we could have why that star is there. Okay, so that's a lot of just a little trivia bit for you. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Merci beaucoup. Donc, avant de commencer, on va jouer un peu ensemble. We're going to actually play a little game. And I'd like you to actually put your answers for this first question in the chat. En français ou en anglais, ça me m'est égal. Donc, selon vous, quelle est votre nationalité? Américain, américaine, canadien, canadienne, autre? Les premiers deux, oui. Américaine, américaine, canadienne. Les deux, oui. Voilà, américaine, excellent. Voilà, américain et suédoise, bienvenue, excellent. Les deux, oui, super. Donc, il y a la grande majorité qui se dit américain ou américaine aujourd'hui. Ouais. Moi, je suis canadienne et américaine. Je viens des parents américains, mais j'étais née au Nouveau-Brunswick. Donc, j'ai les deux nationalités. C'est super, ça. Et donc aussi, vous pouvez le mettre dans le chat ici, votre réponse à la deuxième question. Votre nationalité pour vous, ça représente quoi? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Par exemple, si je vous pose la question, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire être américain, américaine? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire être suédoise? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire être haïtienne? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire être canadien, canadienne? J'aimerais voir, I'd like to see some of your answers. And it can just be words, doesn't have to be a full sentence. L'héritage. What else? So heritage, we're talking about who your ancestors are. Oui, les ancêtres. La culture. Être fier de sa culture. Oh, wow, ça c'est super pour les Acadiens. Un mélange de culture. Ouais. Ouh, l'orientation. Oh, wow, la liberté. This is awesome. Ouais. Anything else? Super. Donc, on voit, il y a tout un mélange de représentation. Le passeport, l'éducation. Il y a toute sorte de représentation pour qu'est-ce que ça veut dire être d'une certaine nationalité ou avoir la citoyenneté. Et c'est vraiment intéressant de voir comment que les Acadiens répondent à cette question. C'est super intéressant de voir comment que les Canadiens anglophones versus les Canadiens francophones répondent à la question. So if I were to answer this question, what does it mean to be Canadian? one of my first things would be, pour moi, c'est la language. It's a big part of who I am and how I grew up with my education. French is not my first language, as you've probably picked up already, but it is a big part of how I grew up. And for me, that represents a lot of being Canadian, as opposed to when I moved to the United States some 15 years ago. It is definitely something that I have not identified with in the States. I haven't been able to latch on to any notion of language association with an American identity, an American nationality. I talk a lot about language in my research, in my classes, and so I always try to make this connection of the relationship between who one is and the language or languages and the varieties that they speak and what that means to one's own identity. So let's talk a little bit more about this as we go further. Can we move to the next slide, please? Perfect. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. Quelques objectifs pour aujourd'hui, for today's meeting. If I say webinar, it's just a slip of the tongue. Donc, aujourd'hui, on va réfléchir à la notion d'identité individuelle, communautaire, nationale, culturelle, linguistique, all representations of what identity can mean. And this is something that is more, you can attempt it in different ways across the various K-12 levels. Probably the presentation that I have here today is more geared towards high school, but it is definitely something that can be modified for the littles in different versions. But I'll mainly be addressing more the high schools. So, pourquoi parler des Acadiens? That's something else. It's like, why is learning about Acadians important today? This series is about diversifying the French curriculum, by all means. On va regarder tout un petit survol historique des Acadiens et leur présence dans le monde actuel, because of the importance of their history is a big part of who Acadians are today and what makes them very distinct from other French groups within Canada. Démontrer que l'Acadie est tenace, persévérante, vibrante, contemporaine et francophone. To go back to the title of this, Acadia Strong. Tenace, persévérante. If you're familiar with with the Acadian history, you'll probably agree with that. Comment parler de l'Acadie dans la salle de classe? On va parler un peu de l'évangéline versus la sanguine, un peu le héros, anti-héros, héroïne de l'Acadie. On va aussi regarder un peu Acadiman et un programme qui s'appelle Ado Santé, of how c'est le, what is it, a comic strip known as Acadiman. He's known as the first Acadian superhero. And he, to an extent, has been even part of a government program in New Brunswick to help students. We'll get into that. And then at the end, I have a nice big list of resources that you can access when you get the recording for this meeting. Alors, let's continue. Next slide, please. Voilà, merci beaucoup. Un peu à propos de moi, comme Kyla a mentionné il y a quelques minutes, je suis originaire de Fredericton au Nouveau-Brunswick. Et là, j'ai appris le français en immersion. J'ai commencé à parler le français très, très jeune, à l'âge de 3 ans, même avant que j'ai commencé l'école parce que j'ai des frères aînés. Donc, j'ai parlé français depuis très, très jeune. Et j'ai continué pendant tous mes programmes d'université. Mais même si j'étais dans un programme d'immersion, je parlais français tous les jours à Fredericton. Fredericton, c'est une province officiellement bilingue. J'étais vraiment ignorante de la présence acadienne qui se retrouve au Nouveau-Brunswick et ailleurs, parce que les Acadiens ne se retrouvent pas seulement au Nouveau-Brunswick. J'étais ignorante de la réalité. Je pensais à ça quand j'étais jeune. French is French. I learned French from many of my teachers, and I knew that they all spoke a bit differently, but I didn't know the reasons why and what that meant for the diversity of French in Canada and outside of Canada's borders. And I really only became interested in Acadia and language of Acadians, and really French more in general, when I went to Belgium in 1997. It was a summer trip, and this trip was amazing. And I think I like to tell this story because it's very impactful for the rest of what ended up being a pursuit of a PhD, and then my career, which is Francophone Studies, Acadian Studies, and now my position as Director of Center for Canadian American Studies. I received a scholarship to go study French in Belgium in the summer. And I didn't even know at the time who was paying for it. But it was actually La Société Nationale de l'Acadie that I found out about it afterwards. All I knew is that the French program where I was at the University of New Brunswick just say, here's an application, you can apply to go to Belgium, it's completely paid for. Okay, it didn't even say who was funding that. Problem number one of the levels of power and the visibility of the Acadians. They weren't even acknowledged in this application. So I went, and it was people from all around the world came to learn French or to study French for summer, literature classes, language classes, culture classes. There's a lot of them that go on every single year, every single summer, all the time. And there was a large group of Canadians there, maybe about 15. I was the only one who spoke English as a first language. All the others, ils parlaient français comme langue première, et ils s'identifiaient comme Acadiens. I was the minority. I'd never had that experience before, where my group of friends all had one different language that they spoke, and I was the outsider. And it was interesting just finding my way and being that minority person for a while, and realizing that there is an entire different culture that I was ignorant of that is very lively and vibrant in Brunswick. And les Acadiens de ce groupe, they welcomed me so well after just a couple of days. And I remember asking one of them why. I said, why are you guys being so nice to me? Because they would often complain about how they had been treated by English-speaking neighbors or the government. I say, well, English is my first language. You guys are really nice to me. And they're like, you show an interest in who we are. You want to know about us. You're asking questions. You can be one of us. Tu es partie de la communauté acadienne. C'est pas Acadienne de souche. I'm not Acadian by nature, de souche. But Christina, tu fais partie de la communauté acadienne. So I was kind of like adopted, I felt. And I'm still friends with them, some of them to this day. Some of them are getting rather elderly and some are my age, but we still remain in contact. And so I owe a lot to them. So I'm very grateful. That's a little bit about my story. And let's go to the next slide, please. Now we're getting into the meat a little bit. For those of you who were here the other week and were joined by Lauren Rose Dunnell, she gave the first presentation of this web series, and she spoke about les métiers. She had this really nice slide that you see in front of you. I took a screenshot of it. And it's of her, what is often comes up in her classroom when she talks about la francophonie, and she teaches the littles, like the really little ones. And so here you see, various flags. You see Poutine, Macron. You see the lemurs, Madagascar. You do see the Acadian flag, and so there is some, some diversity on here. But what is really remarkable to me is the number of flags. And flags often have a representation of a physical space, right? Borders. And in the middle of this slide is the flag of Acadia. Acadia has no borders. There is no physical space that is currently, there used to be, but there is no map that shows this is where Acadia is. Now, if you were to go and ask various Acadians, where is Acadia? Où est l'Acadie? Où se trouve? Which I did actually for my PhD. I did a bunch of map overlays which is really interesting. I drew then maps of where these participants said Acadia was. There are so many different versions, and it all depends on what their definition of Acadia is. Is it a geographical location for them? And for some people, yes. And for some, it's very, very limited to a coastline. Others answered, they said, well, I can't draw a map. Parce que l'Acadie, c'est où est-ce qu'on trouve des Acadiens? Wherever we find Acadians, that's Acadia. And others were very, very precise in their answer. And they said, l'Acadie, c'est les parties francophones du Nouveau-Brunswick. Mais pas Moncton, pas la ville de Moncton. Now, this was back in 2005. Things have changed as well. I'm wondering what the answers would be now. But they would say, yeah, wherever there's French spoken in New Brunswick, but not Moncton. Moncton is corrupted by English in their French. So there's these language attitudes that people have towards other people who may identify as Acadian, but speak a different variety. Of course, you're not Acadian because you have English in your language, or you're not Acadian because you don't live along the coast. So it's what I'm getting at is comment que c'est difficile pour un groupe d'avoir une idée qui ils sont quand ils n'ont pas de territoire actuel. This is something that I like to talk about with my students, is that when we have refugees, immigrants coming into our country, they often come, they've left their home and they need to find a new one. And so they almost start from not having borders anymore. And so they have to rely on these other facets of identity, la langue, la nourriture, les traditions, l'héritage, les ancêtres. So this is the same thing with the Acadians. And it's a really interesting discussion to have with students, to get them to think about their place in the world if a border didn't exist. If they didn't have a passport, because the passport really represents also quite often your place within a political border. And it can be a very powerful discussion with students. So I like to encourage discussions around that and how to go about that. There are ways to do that. So we'll look into that. Let's go to the next slide, please. So ma francophonie is, like I said, je ne suis pas acadienne, mais je suis membre de la communauté acadienne. Okay? Ma francophonie est très différente de la francophonie des petits élèves de Lauren Rose that you just saw. And what I have here are just some images of how I relate to Acadie. They're not the only ones by any means, but I just chose a few. So if you would like to put in the chat, if you know any of these images, if you know the person, with the guitar, do you know who she is? Do you know that? What's that with all the people to the right? What's that image? Do you know, if you can explain any of these images, would you put that into the chat? Lisa Leblanc. C'est Lisa Leblanc with a guitar. Any of the other images? Le tintamarre, oui, Corinne. La trappe de homard. Yep. Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll go clockwise, and I'll start with that cartoon person in the top left. That's Acadian, the first superhero of Acadia, the first Acadian superhero. And he's been around for a little while now. And his superpower is that he speaks a dialect, an Acadian dialect called Chiac, which has a mixture of French and English. He lives in Moncton. And he says that's his superpower because he doesn't care about what people think. It's a pretty powerful statement. And so it's representative, his dialect is representative of where he is, Moncton in southeastern New Brunswick is a very bilingual city, and it's sort of the arts center of French New Brunswick right now. It has Université de Moncton, UMoncton, the Moncton campus. The university has 2 other campuses in New Brunswick, but it's the main one. And Moncton also has a lot of jobs, especially in like the call center industry or any sort of service industry that requires English and French, very strong knowledge of it. And so if you're in that area, if you don't have English, you can get by just fine, but if you don't have French, you can't get by either and make a successful living. They really go together. And so with this language contact comes Chiac. And Chiac is what Lisa Leblanc, who is the artist that you see in the middle, Lisa Leblanc, she sings in Chiac. And she came out with, she's had a number of albums. She just came out with one called Chiac Disco. And it hit the charts within hours. It was so popular. And it's a really funky album where she takes traditional Acadian language and Chiac and instruments, but makes it or gives it a disco funk sound. So she is showing of just how one contemporary, vibrant, and easy Acadia is to mold to new realities and changes. It's not stuck. It adapts very well, and it created a brand new sound. You should check it out. So it's called Chiac Disco. It's a lot of fun. And I actually have a video linked in this PowerPoint. To the next one, we have an image of the tintamarre. Now, tintamarre really means like great big noise. And it happens, it's a parade that happens every August 10th. It's coming up, or August 15th. August 10th is my brother's birthday. Jeez. Donc, la fête nationale des Acadiens, c'est le 15 août. And one of the best parts of it is this tintamarre, where everyone just gets into the street with any type of noisemaker. Traditionally, it's pots and pans, but it's any type of noisemaker, you know, the ones that you blow into at hockey games now, whatever those are called, or instruments, anything. And you just make noise, and you walk down the street of the town, making noise, dressed in Acadian colors, with members of your family tree that date back generations. They'll often converge on the same city and walk together. And so the tintamarre, which means big noise, it is meant as an alert to the Anglophone community, saying, hey, we're here, we'll make noise. We're not going anywhere. Even though the Anglophone community has a larger population, stronger in government, of course, it's the community of power. The Acadians aren't going anywhere. The Francophone, ils restent là. And this is one of their traditional ways of showing that. It's a lot of fun. Continuing down and clockwise, the Université de Moncton, that's their symbol. So they have a very strong university in Moncton and 2 other campuses, very strong in language and culture and history and Acadian studies. And it's entirely in French. So that's one of their powerful. They attract a lot of students. So it's very hip and vibrant, young feeling in Moncton. That river there, that's the St. John River Valley. Now, I grew up on the St. John River Valley outside of Fredericton, but the St. John River flows all the way up to northwest New Brunswick, to the opposite corner of Moncton. And it's very French there as well. They are Acadian. Some of them will say they are, some will say they aren't for various reasons, but it's a completely different reality. It's not the East Coast. It's not fishing. It's not shack. It's woods, forest, potatoes, a lot of potato farming, forestry, and a lot of connections with people living right across the border in Quebec and right across the border in Maine, which brings on a whole different aspect of Acadian identity. So I grew up along the river, but not quite so far north. And so that's part of my reality as well, because I see the connections, and I see the diversity. Then on a la trappe à homard, lobster trap from the East Coast. And if you were to speak a traditional Acadian, it would be homard, it would be umar. And then, of course, we have the lighthouse, which I already spoke about. Let's go to the next slide. So here, there are 2 videos. I'm going to ask that the first one, the one on the left only, is played. It's a quick 2.5 minute video that gives you a very, very brief overview of some of the very tragic history that really sets up why it is important to learn and to speak about the Acadian. So I'll let the Alumni Association, Janine, thank you so much to play that.
Welcome to the Ancestral Findings Podcast. Do you have a Cajun surname? Did you know that?
Here we go. Merci beaucoup. Sorry for the little glitches that happened there. You know, technology, we count on it a lot, and then sometimes it has to take a nap. So the Acadians, as you can see, were persecuted and dispersed. And so that is why they are all around the world now. Let's go to the next slide, actually.
Special revolutionaries in any way.
Oh, next slide. There. For those of you who may have had trouble watching the videos, of course, they're going to be embedded in the recording that you will receive. So for those of you who have some interest in history, there are these maps here that show sort of the different directions in which Acadians either were deported, those are the big blue arrows, in the mid 1700s, 1755 to 75. A lot of them were deported down to along the East Coast, all the way down to Georgia even. And these deportations continued for years. And other Acadians, they fled the deportations that were conducted on behalf of the British Crown. Others, once they were deported, they tried to get back to their homeland. And so these people, the migrants, are depicted by the green arrows. So you can see it going all the way down over the various years. It goes down to Martinique, to Santo Domingo, to the Falkland Islands. They're going over to France, and then they're down again. So really, there's this huge the presence of Acadians everywhere, if your definition of Acadians depend on blood. If you can trace your family back, because over time, of course, language will change. So that, again, it comes into the whole question, what does it mean to be Acadian? If it's blood, then Acadians are everywhere. If it's a certain dialect, then of course that is different. If it's a certain tradition, then again, that is different. Traditions change, food changes through these deportations. We have the very vibrant Cajun culture down in Louisiana, which of course is a result of deportations. Deportations did not occur to Louisiana directly. They occurred down through the eastern colonies, as you can see, and then the deportees, some of them migrated down to Louisiana because there was a French presence there, and they thought that they could potentially find some of their long-lost cousins or have something in common. Language, relatively common, or relatively similar, and a common religion. And so over 10,000 Acadians were deported, and this actually has been acknowledged as the first state-sponsored case of ethnic cleansing in North America. If you were to click on that link, and I'm not going to have it opened right now, but it gives a definition of ethnic cleansing according to the United Nations, and every single bullet item can be applied to the deportation of the Acadians, to forcibly remove families. Now, why would you do that? It is to break up a culture and to eliminate them. We know stories about this in more contemporary modern times, unfortunately, but this is the first case in North America. And so that is, if you were to think, if the British hadn't deported the Acadians, what would it look like today? It's a pretty sombering history, but one that we should not forget because it is a part of North America's history. Let's continue to the next slide. I don't want to make light of it, but I am also looking at the time. So in that video, you did see a little bit of representation of the Maritimes, and it's kind of replicated here. La diaspora Acadienne, the diaspora, it's vibrant, it's everywhere, depending on what your definition is. It is a nation without borders, but with economic, cultural, and ethnic boundaries. So yes, I mentioned that the Moncton area has a very different economy and language than what you'd see up in Grand Sault and Edmundston in northwestern New Brunswick, which is very different than what you'd see in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. So there are imaginary borders that are very, very culturally regulated or governed almost. There's a huge presence in the Atlantic provinces, including Newfoundland, in Quebec. Quebec has a population of about 8 million. Over 1 million of Quebec's residents have Acadian heritage, actually. That's pretty significant. And if you were to look, there are some websites that I found, I have to remember what they are, but you can look at a list of all the different locations around Montreal and all the different street names that are named after an Acadian family, for example. It's pretty impressive. The Acadian communities are found along the US Eastern Seaboard, Texas, Florida, Louisiana. So, and you could see from the other maps prior, they're dispersed they're everywhere. There's still a strong Acadian presence of folks in France, people who call us, je suis Acadienne, je ne suis pas française, because they were then deported, and then they were part of the deportation, and then part of a migration. back to France, but they kept that heritage. And my knowledge is much more focused on New Brunswick. I don't have a huge amount of, well, I have some expertise on Louisiana, but none that I am confident right now to have huge discussions on, but I'm happy to entertain some questions about the Cajuns, because I know that is always of huge interest. But my knowledge more resides around the Maritimes. Les Îles-de-la-Madeleine, yes, Les Îles-de-la-Madeleine, there's a huge community of Acadians in Les Îles-de-la-Madeleine, which is part of Quebec. Let's go to the next. We're starting getting into some resources now. So how do you want to, comment parler de l'Acadie avec vos élèves? Well, one, I actually was gifted this little book, and it's called Au revoir l'Acadie. And I'm not going to have these two little videos played, but you can access them when you get the recording. And it's written by a woman named Kimberly R. Anderson, who, I mean, I hesitated showing you this resource because the author is not Acadian. But the resource is very well done. It tells the story of the deportation from the perspective of a certain family. And it's quite, it's well done in that it doesn't glean over any of the gory details. And it's written for high school level, and there is a glossary of Acadian vocabulary. It's really, really well done. And I was thrilled earlier this year in February. I went to upstate New York, near in Plattsburgh, actually, and I went for a week to do some workshops and some research, etc. And part of my stay there was to go into a high school. C'était une classe de 11e année. Et c'était un cours de français. Donc, l'objectif, c'était de parler de l'Acadie. And they were reading this book, grade 11 students. They were reading this book, and so they had all these questions for me. And it gave me such a thrill to walk into this class and seeing students who were like 16, 17 years old reading this book that's appropriate for their age level and appropriate in how it describes what happened to the Acadians. And so it got them thinking about what it meant to live in a place without borders. And then we discussed what it meant to be American, what it means to be a Canadian, and how to talk about some of these very difficult issues. It was quite thrilling. Let's go to the next slide. There is a link at the end of this slide where you can purchase this little book if you want. It's not very thick. So the next slide, I apologize that when I uploaded the screen, the previous slide. Yes, when I uploaded this image, the little red circles did not transfer properly. So I apologize for this. So what I'd like to, how many of you, just put into the chat with like a yes or thumbs up, who have heard of Evangeline? Yep. Yeah, no. Good. Now, Evangeline, it's a fictitious story, but it is, and it has been for years, sort of the benchmark of teaching kids and anyone who's interested the history of the Acadians, the deportation. Evangeline is actually a poem, and it's written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Does that sound like an Acadian French name to you? Not at all. And the story is of a young woman who has been deported. Her name is Evangeline, and she's separated, she's wrenched from her true love, Gabriel. And the stories of her trying to find him after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the Traité de Paris, in 1763, when the Acadians were allowed to try and make their way back to the Maritimes. But she was trying to find her long lost love, and she found him in Philadelphia in his dying breath. And this poem is very long. It's very dense. It became a huge sensation in classes. I saw it being taught in high schools. I saw it being taught at universities. But when you read it, it is so romanticized. It is not an authentic representation of what happened. It was all about this woman's love to find, to try and find Gabriel. Spoke not, the tragedy of what really happened. So the history was lost for many people. They didn't know really of the travesties that they faced. They didn't know what the British did. They didn't know about this ethnic cleansing. They didn't know that families were ripped apart and burned alive. That tens of thousands of Acadians died at the hands of British. And what I have here on the screen is just a prelude. And unfortunately, the red, like I mentioned, the red circles did not transfer properly. What I wanted to circle was actually on the first line. This is the forest primeval. And then the second one I wanted to circle was stands like druids of eld with voices sad and prophetic. Does that sound realistic? In the opening of this poem that became so popular, you were learning about talking trees and druids instead of who these people are. So then, we have a real héroïne, une héroïne acadienne. C'est la Sagouine, which is the woman that you see to the right. So if you haven't heard of La Sagouine, let's stay on this slide for just a moment. La Sagouine is also a literary phenomenon. It was written by Antonine Maillet. She turned 93 or 94 a few months ago. And the book is called La Sagouine and is a series of monologues written by this fictitious woman, only known as La Sagouine, which roughly translates to washerwoman. And it's a series of monologues where she talks to herself and to Keppie, who's one of the other major characters. And she talks to him about various aspects of being Acadian. And it's pretty eye-opening. What I want to do is go to the next slide and show you a little version of it. Let's go to the next slide. So here is this slide and the next one. It's just it's a little crooked, I realize that, but it's a photocopy of part of one of the monologues. It's my favorite one. It's called Le Recensement. Le Recensement is the census. So what happens at a census? You're asked your name, where you're born, what languages you speak, what's your nationality, all the demographic questions. And this is the monologue of La Sagouine reflecting on someone coming to her door and asking her these questions. Now we remember, qui sont les Acadiens? C'est un peuple avec une langue complètement en évolution, en contact avec beaucoup de cultures. C'est une culture c'est une culture diverse. Les Acadiens ont des définitions de souche, des définitions des ancêtres. So there's ancestry that's different. There's no physical, geographical borders. So all these things that go into a census, it's kind of asking, how do I answer some of these questions when there's often just like a box to tick? There's no box quite often for the Acadians. And I'm going to draw your attention to the second page of this slide here, Le Recensement. And I'm going to read it. It's the third paragraph, the second full paragraph on that page. No, the previous slide, please. There, yes. So it says at the bottom, page 130, the third paragraph there where it says Je vivons. And I'm just going to read it. And you'll notice it's written in a different variety than many of us have ever encountered. I don't always have the best Acadian accent, but I'm going to exaggerate a little bit today. Je vivons en Amérique. Ben, je ne sont pas des Américains. Non, les Américains, ils travaillent dans les shops aux États. Puis ils s'en venons se promener par ici sur nos côtes. L'été en culotte blanche, puis en parlant anglais. Ils sont riches, les Américains. J'en sens point. Nous autres, vivons au Canada. Ça fait que je devons plutôt être des Canadiens, ça me semble. Now, what is she talking about right here? Je vivons en Amérique. Now, right there, you're like, wait a minute, there's something I don't understand about the conjugation. Yeah, conjugations are different in Acadian French and traditional Acadian French. Je vivons en Amérique, it's we, nous vivons. We live in America, but we're not Americans. No, Americans, they live in the shops down in the States. And they come here to, walk around on their, on the plage, on the coast in white shorts, and they speak English. And they're rich, the Americans, right? And we're not. We live in Canada, so we should be Canadians, it seems. And then it continues. Ben, ça se peut pas non plus, parce que les Dysart, puis les Carroll, puis les Jones, c'est pas des gens de notre race. Ça. Puis ça vit au Canada et tout. S'ils sont des Canadiens, je ne pourrais pas en être, nous autres. Par rapport qu'ils sont des Anglais, puis nous autres sont des Français. So it goes on, and it's like, well, I'm not Canadian, because Canadians have names like Dysart and Carroll and Jones, and they speak English, but no, okay, so if we don't speak English, we're French. And then she goes on and said, oh no, we can't be French because we don't live in France. And it continues on to the next page, onto the next slide. Let's go there. Excellent. And right at the end of the top on page 131, that first little paragraph that's just finishing there. So, pour l'amour de Dieu, où c'est que je vivons, nous autres? Love of God, where do we live? Where are we living? Again, how can you define who you are when it's hard to put it down on an official government document? Something to think about and to talk about with students, with people who, students who are part of DACA, for example. They don't have that passport, and it's hard for them to talk about their position within the United States. So I find speaking about this recensement to students, it creates a sense of reflection for them. And you can do it in English or French. And I'm going to go down to, if we go to the next slide, you see here, there is, I don't know if that video, yes, there is a video there that I will let you listen to. She essentially, you'll hear the dialect when you get the recording, you'll hear the dialect, and it's of La Sagouine, played by Viola Léger, who just passed away. You'll hear her speak those exact words that I just read, or a version of them, and you'll hear that dialect, and it's absolutely fantastic. And so speaking of language, you saw that there are some changes. If you go to the next slide, you also have, yep, thank you. You have what came out of old traditional Acadian is le chèque, one of the dialects. Here you have Lisa Leblanc, and here you have Radio. Let's play maybe about 30 seconds of Lisa Leblanc, since we saw a photo of her before and we spoke about her. And this is one of her newest songs.
Pourquoi faire aujourd'hui ce que tu pourrais faire demain? Pourquoi faire aujourd'hui ce que tu pourrais faire demain? Pourquoi faire aujourd'hui ce que tu pourrais faire demain? Pourquoi faire aujourd'hui ce que tu pourrais faire demain? Ce que tu pourrais faire demain?
Excellent. They got a little sense of, how contemporary and different the Acadian music right now is, and this comes right out of Moncton. It had that disco funk sound to it, and she sings in Chiac. You may have noticed there's a little bit of English in there, and so students love this. They love learning about language contact, because then they learn that there's not just one way to speak French. And it makes them feel a little bit more relaxed when they learn that it's okay to have some English in your French because it represents a different culture. I mean, depending on what your objectives are in the classroom, but it's like, there are these people and they have a way of speaking that reflects their reality of language contact. And if we don't acknowledge them, we're just continuously going about in this circle of there's only one way to speak. And that's actually very, very limiting for a student who's trying to learn French. And it puts a lot of pressure on. So like there's no one way to speak French. There's a lot of ways, and they get a lot of fun out of Lisa Leblanc and Acadia, who's also it's a fun group. And Lisa Leblanc, it was playing in that classroom I spoke to you about, the grade 11s. It was playing when I arrived, and the students were like, Lisa Leblanc, do you know her? Do you like connaît Madame Keppie? I said, oh yeah, I know her. We love her. It was so much fun. I was impressed. And the last little bit I'm going to talk to you about, let's switch slides, is Acadian.
Faire une sieste, my to-do list.
Technology. Perfect. So Acadian, you've seen a photo or an image of him already. Now Acadian, I mentioned that he also speaks Chiac. And he's a superhero. He works on a call center. He lives in his mom's basement. If you were to click on the Acadian link right there, it'll take you to the website. It's pretty fun to read it, and it's all written in Chiac. And it's a story about him and his friends. He lives in his mom's basement that you see in the image right here. And he speaks Chiac and doesn't care what the government thinks. He doesn't care what other people outside of the Moncton area think. He goes, this is who I am. This is my Acadia. It represents who I am. Very, very powerful. And has become a bit of, in a way, a model for some Acadian youth. I want to be like him, at least adopt his mentality. And so what the government did is they created this site called Ado Santé. I have it linked in there. And Ado Santé is, it's amalgamating adolescence and santé, health, bring them together. And it's a series of short clips, 2 to 3 minute long, of Acadian and his friends encountering some kind of issue that is often difficult to talk to with adolescents. So these videos are about alcohol, drugs, sexual health, violence, and it's a little adventure that happens in this 2-3 minute clip. And it's a way that the government and then the school board has brought in Acadian, really this representation of a Chiac and of an area in New Brunswick, Acadian culture, and use that as a means to dive into some of these difficult topics with students. Really, really powerful. So let's play again about 30 seconds of this particular clip, and you will see what it's about, and you'll hear the language. You'll hear some Chiac.
So, je disais à Delcia, hey, qu'est-ce que tu fais demain soir? Aimerais-tu voir la movie? Peut-être aller grobber? Puis elle a dit, alright. Puis là, oh, attends une minute, je vais aller chercher un autre café.
Olé, Acadian est speedé aujourd'hui.
Yeah, shit. C'est sa 4e cup de coffee, puis il y a rien que 9h30.
Non. Il a juste pas beaucoup d'énergie. Mon garçon abusait jamais du café. Il est juste perky. Peut-être qu'il trouvera un job avec toute son énergie.
Yeah, thank you. Now, last little question in the chat is, did you notice, did you pick up any little bits of English in that? It did go pretty fast. Yeah, what did you pick up? Il est speedé. He's high, he's high on coffee. That was one of them. He's just perky, right? Yeah, a lot of fun. So you can access all those videos by going in onto Ado Santé. Yeah, coffee. Yeah. So I introduced that to students when I was in Plattsburgh, and they then asked the teacher if they could use that in their curriculum. I said, can we watch some of this video and have a discussion? Because the students were, they're grade 11. Some of them are starting to look into partying a little bit. Oh, we should use this. Can we do this? And it's been very successful. I think the website is a little under construction at the moment, but you can still access the videos. I love it. It's a good tool. And Acadian website itself has a big lexique of Acadian vocabulary that is used frequently in the little videos too. So it's a lot of fun. So here we go. Last slide. Let's move on to the next slide. Just to finish. So to sum up, en étudiant l'Acadie et la culture acadienne, what do we learn? We learn that tragic but important history is not forgotten. Students learn an identity and belonging must be nurtured, discussed. Students can make connections between Acadia and the stories and experiences of immigrants, refugees. You learn how to talk about borders or the absence of. And we're using this wonderful, wonderful culture to, j'oublie mes mots en anglais, it's been a long day, to nurture these types of topic conversations. They see how language evolves over time through contact with other cultures. And they learn that there's more than one way to speak French. Very, very important. And that's all I could ever ask of students, is to be comfortable and not to think that everything, not to be so worried about making a certain mistake, depending on what the objective of the classes and of the lesson is. There is a time and place, but there's also a time and place to learn about diversity of language. And the last slide has a list of resources for you, as in addition to what has already been linked. National Film Board of Canada, you see there has tons of videos. If you just go in there and type in Acadie or Acadien, and there's documentaries, little videos, short ones. There's, if you are interested in food, there's some resources there. Pantry and Palette is a huge, beautifully written cookbook by a friend of mine, Simon Thibault, he took his grandmother's recipes and talks about them and how they're incorporated into Acadian culture. This is an Acadian culture from Nova Scotia. Acadian cuisine for kids. There are some DVDs, L'Acadie sans frontières, Code of Fil, and of course, there are tons and tons and tons of musical artists that are very, very easy to find. Also, if you were just to do a quick little Google search, but some of these I find particularly fun to go through. So that's all I've got for today. If there are questions, I'm happy to entertain them, whether you want to unmute and ask them orally or put them into the chat. It's been fun. We have a few minutes. Merci. Any question?
Has a question.
Oh, yep, go ahead.
Are there such things as podcasts in Acadian that we could listen to? When I was in France in May, my French friends just came back from New Brunswick where they were visiting their son, and they had heard the Acadian accent so much. They were absolutely fascinated by it and were enthusiastic about the sound of it being so beautiful. Can I hear it in something other than a comic book format?
One resource that I always use is Radio Canada. If you go to the Radio Canada website, they have a link for podcasts. And of course, Radio-Canada is very regional, and where, you know, you can go on to Radio-Canada Nouveau-Brunswick, wherever you can change your region. And so that'll help. That's a good spot to start.
Thank you.
Often there will be a section for La Jeunesse as well. Anything else? I'm seeing a list of some nice comments there in the chat, but yeah. I always learn something every time I speak about Acadia, even though I've lived a lot of this for a lot of my life. You know, it's always fun just to go over and think about some of these issues again.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you, Christina. And I know there was lots in the chat of other resources that have been shared, etc. So we'll be sure to add those to the resources we're going to send out. So I really appreciated that. I'm just making sure. Okay, great. No, lots of thanks. So for that very lively, great discussion. So thank you everyone so much for joining us today. And thank you, Christina. And thank you again to the Center for Canadian American Studies and the Western Washington University Alumni Association. We hope you will join us for our final session, which is next Monday, July 31st. And that's on the topic of Quebec and the changing face of French there. Very excited about that as well, to finish off this series, and hope to see you there. And as we said, we will be sending out a recording and a list of resources in a few days for you to help you bring this into your classroom. So see you next week. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Fait grand plaisir. Salut.